Stanford University.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Brian Knudsen, who is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Stanford and the director of the Symbiotic Project on Affective Neuroscience, which explores what happens in the brain when we're experiencing different emotions and when we're making decisions. And he's actually one of the world's leading neuroeconomists. His research has illuminated things like what happens in your brain when you spot a bargain, and why it is that sexy photos can make men make more risky investment choices. But it's not all sex and shopping, although that would be good. But not just sex and shopping, he also has a more altruistic side. He has done research for the Stanford Center for Compassion and Altruism, looking at the brain basis of altruism and doing good. And he also is an advisor to a company called Consumerology, which I actually don't know anything about, but I hear that it's a company that uses psychological neuroscience research to help consumers make better healthcare choices. And so I'm hoping we're going to get to talk a little bit about that in our conversation later on. So please join me in welcoming Brian Knudsen.
It's always a pleasure to be up on this stage. Kelly and I have taught Psych 1 in this room before when it was older and a little bit rattier. But it's especially a pleasure to be up on the stage tonight because all of you are a much more diverse audience than we're used to in Psych 1. And I'm really looking forward to not only hearing me speak, but hearing you speak and getting your feedback and questions. And by the way, if there's anything that you find puzzling during the talk or that you think you'd like to clarify, just raise your hand. I'm happy to stop and try to clarify. I have no, yes, Kelly.
Is the microphone on?
Oh, see, there you go. It pays off. It is on now. Okay, sorry. So, if you didn't hear that, you didn't miss much. So I'm going to talk about, the title of my talk is This Is Your Brain on Money. And I'd like to admit up front that I never really was that interested in money. Otherwise, I wouldn't have an advanced degree and be teaching psychology. But it's actually emotion that got me interested in money. And so I am not an economist. I've trained as a psychologist and a neuroscientist. But I have the good fortune of being able to speak to many economists and people in finance and to do research on these topics. And so I'm hoping you'll see at the end of this talk that there really is a consilience and an interesting intersection between our emotional lives and our financial choices. But before I get to that, I'd like to start with what I consider to be a funny image. How many of you recognize this image? Wow, good. I'm not completely dating myself. This is a Nirvana album cover. But that's not why I find the image funny. I find it funny because if I threw my kids in the swimming pool and did this, there's no way they would be doing that. They would not swim after the money. They'd scream and kick and cry. And I'm not going to do the experiment, but I'm just saying. They would not do that. And so I think that's one reason this is funny. They're kind of making fun of the human propensity to run after money and implying that this is ingrained at a very early age. And I doubt that's the case. We have to learn it. Kids do not salivate when you dangle dollar bills in front of their faces. But many adults will show similar salivatory-like behaviors when they see cues that they might make money. And I want to stress here that it's not just making the money that gets them excited. It's actually seeing signals and signs and cues that indicate that they might make money. This is kind of a critical point in my talk, and it has to do with technological advances that allow us to see what's happening in the brain in real time. And so monetary outcomes can influence our emotions, both for good and for bad, as we've seen in the last decade. And as many of you who look at your stock portfolios on a regular basis maybe feel more like these guys. I know I do. But I want to make this point that it's not, again, that it's not just the monetary outcomes that influence us, but really, and maybe on a larger scale that drive the market, but it's really what we're anticipating might happen. And I also want to make the point that it's not just that we're projecting, we're sort of predicting symbolically, oh, this stock might go up, that might go down. The probability of that happening is X, Y, or Z. It's that we feel something when we're projecting. And the question is, if we do feel something, is that motivating us to do something different than we would normally do? And if you scale that up, can that influence actually things like the market? And so I'd like to start with two dominant models of humans, admittedly oversimplified, and probably not accurate. No one would actually endorse these models, but yet they kind of illustrate two ends of a continuum. that we have for thinking about humans and how they behave when making decisions, especially financial decisions. The one on the left is the rational actor model. So this model is actually a popular model, contrary to what you might expect. It's widely held in many fields, including my own field, psychology, also in economics and finance. The idea is that people are consistent in their choices. And you may have heard a little bit about this from the previous speaker, Babashev. But the idea is that if they prefer apples to oranges today, they will prefer apples to oranges tomorrow. This is a very important fundamental axiomatic property of human choice. Second, that humans have unlimited attention, so they can kind of understand everything that's going on and all the options that are out there that are available to them and take that in and process it. Related to that, they have perfect memory, so they remember everything that happened to them and are able to summon all their preferences at a moment's notice. And finally, because of all these fantastic attributes the rational actor has, the rational actor is unbiased. Now, the rational actor may have preferences, so they may prefer apples to oranges, whereas another rational actor may prefer oranges to apples. But again, those are consistent preferences. They don't flop around, and they're not subject to strange things that happen in the atmosphere or that happen on this ticker tape or what they had for lunch or what their daughter said to them that morning, or anything like that. Okay, so that's one model. Here's another model, the not-so-rational actor. So this actor obviously is different from the rational actor. They are sometimes inconsistent. They suffer from limited attention. They have imperfect memory. And sometimes they're biased, meaning that they're not always consistent. Sometimes they'll choose this way, sometimes they'll choose that way. And sometimes their biases are due to the circumstances that they're in. Now, obviously, we might prefer to be like this rational actor, but if we look at the data, I'm going to contend that some of us are like the not-so-rational actor, and that this is important, because if we are like the not-so-rational actor, even if that evens out at the aggregate, it's still going to ruin your life if you can't predict what you're going to do or going to like, and you make silly decisions that you later regret, okay? And so even if this kind of knowledge about how people are not so rational is not useful at the group level, it may be quite useful to you at the individual level. And I would even submit that part of aging, I hope, is gaining wisdom about how you're not so rational and gaming that system so that you can make choices that are more in line with your rational side. Okay, so this leads to two questions that I'd like to address with you tonight. And these questions form the core of what my lab has been doing for the last 10 years, and really of two emerging fields that lie at the intersection of psychology, neuroscience, and economics. The first question is, which brain mechanisms anticipate good and bad events? Now, if you're thinking about the rational actor, you might think, well, there are cognitive mechanisms, there are representational mechanisms. These mechanisms predict, they symbolically represent, they do the calculations, etc. If you're thinking about the not-so-rational actor, you might be thinking about, well, there are sort of emotional pulls. There's greed and fear. There are things that grab you and push you one way or the other. Okay? And this is the subject of a field called affective neuroscience. That is the neuroscience of how emotions work in the brain. And the second set of questions is, if you can identify the brain mechanisms that anticipate good and bad events, does their activity actually influence choice? So it may be that I'm having an emotional reaction, but I'm in complete control. I don't need to pay attention to that. I can overcome it, and I never let it influence me, so I'm always consistent. This is the topic of a field called neuroeconomics. It's sort of at the intersection of neuroscience and economics and some other fields. And I want to point out that just because you solve this problem doesn't mean that necessarily you've solved that problem, okay? There might be brain mechanisms that anticipate good and bad events, but their activity really has no influence on choice. So it's incumbent upon us as scientists to actually investigate both of these questions, not assume that because we've solved this question, we're going to actually find the solution to that question. And that's why I have this little diagram here. You can think of this as a brain. There's stuff going into the brain, input, sensory information, so forth. There's correlated activity in the brain. And then there's some of that correlated activity actually will allow you to predict what the output will be. But this is sort of the one key feature of thinking like a psychologist is that you don't assume that there's nothing here. So you don't assume that just because I know about the input, I'm going to know what the output is. There's a transformation that's occurring. And part of our job as psychologists is to figure out what the transformation is. And the way that we can use the new techniques like brain imaging to do that is to look for overlap in these circles. what is the input causing, and then of that, what is helping us to predict the output? Yes, question, yeah.
What is correlated activity?
Oh, I'm sorry, that's a jargony term. What that means is that if I shine a light in your eyes, and then I take it away, and I shine it and take it away, then what I would expect is that some part of your brain will show more activity when the light's on than when it's off. And so that's just one example of that. But it could get fancier, like if I dangle a $5 bill in front of you, and then I take it away and dangle it, which you're going to see we do, then some parts of your brain might respond to that as well. Okay, and that brings us to localization. The idea behind localization, because we really don't know much about the brain, because we really haven't had the tools to look inside the brain at a second-to-second resolution where we can see in millimeter cubes what's going on in your brain until recently, until about 10 years ago. And those methods are still developing. I know Lima over there runs the imaging facility across the way there, just across the hall. And her cool equipment is allowing us to do this research. So if you have technical questions about it, you can go ask her after the lecture's over. But I want to start further back, not 10 years ago, but 50 years ago, with this picture, which was taken at McGill University by a man named James Olds, who was a social psychologist who had gone there to work with a neurologist named Donald Hebb. And he really didn't know a whole lot about rats. Hebb had rats, and he said, you know, work with my rats. And so Olds went down in the basement and worked with the rats. His idea was he wanted to stick an electrode in the brain and wake up the rats. And he was working with a physicist named Pete Milner. So Milner knew about electrodes. Olds didn't know about anything. Olds said, stick the electrode in the rat brain. Let's put him on this tabletop and see what he does. So they did that, and they stimulated the rat, and lo and behold, they did not get the desired effect. This is common in psychology, but you know, Olds, being a psychologist, persevered, and he watched what the rat was doing, and he noticed that when he took that rat out of its cage and put it back on the tabletop the next day, it went back to the corner of the table where it had been stimulated the day before. And he said, this is very interesting. What if we let the rat stimulate its own brain? And so that's what this rat is doing here. This rat has a wire sticking out of its head, and it's hooked up to this bar right here. And when the rat presses the bar, then it gets a little jolt of electricity in its brain. And when Olds did this, he found something interesting, that this rat would work very hard to press the bar. And it was not distracted by anything else in the cage. It wasn't distracted by food or water or other attractive rats or even sleep. You know, that would just keep pressing that bar vigorously until it was basically exhausted. This probably sounds to some of you like people on the internet. But that notwithstanding, we haven't done the internet study yet. Olds did not know what was going on, obviously, because he didn't know where the electrode was. He couldn't chop off the rat's head because this was a very valuable rat. I mean, you don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, right? So how do you figure out where the electrode is? Well, in those days, he took an X-ray of the rat. And that wasn't so good. The resolution wasn't so great. But he found out that the electrode was sort of deep in the brain, below the cortex. Rats have a cortex, actually, just like us. And, well, not exactly, but it's similar. It was below the cortex in a region of the brain that wasn't well understood, the subcortex. And we're going to hear more about that region because it turns out that a few years later, Swedish neurochemists figured out that a neurotransmitter called dopamine, this is a cross-section of a cartoon of a human brain. So like chop here, and you look in there, and the eyes are over here. And here's the cortex up here. Here's subcortical regions here. These are called dopamine neurons that project from your midbrain up into subcortical regions and cortical regions. And what these Swedish neurochemists found through clever chemical techniques was that there were dopamine neurons in the brain. That was the first discovery, and that they projected into this area. That was the stimulation probe hit in the rat. And it also projected to parts of the cortex. Well, it took another 40 years, actually, for somebody to decide to go and measure what was going on in these neurons, these dopamine neurons. And somebody named Wolfram Schultz did it in monkeys. And he was trying to study movement, and once again, his results did not meet his expectations. So he thought that when a monkey moves, these dopamine neurons will fire. And what he found was that the dopamine neurons were firing all the time, and they were very poorly behaved from an experimental standpoint, until he realized that he should have read Pavlov more closely, because Pavlov also found the same thing with dog salivation, and also found that he can enslave the salivatory response by presenting the dogs with a cue that indicated that they were going to get fed. So the salivation was not responding to the food itself, but to the cue that was presented. Schultz did the same thing, presented monkeys with a cue that indicated they were going to get juice, and suddenly these dopamine neurons started behaving in a predictable way. And what I mean by that is that if the monkey didn't know that the cue signaled juice, and it got juice, this is just a little recording of the firing of these neurons, and each line represents a different recording. These neurons would fire when the juice came, but once the monkey learned that association between the cue and the juice, so the cue could be like a sound or a shape on a screen, their firing moved to the cue presentation. And what he also noticed was that this was not just a surprise response, that the neurons were sort of tracking something surprising that happened, because if he tricked the monkey, he presented the cue, and then didn't give the monkey the juice, boom, there was a decrease in the firing of these neurons, basically. So it seemed that these neurons were tracking not so much the receipt of something good, but the anticipation of something good, the prediction of something good. Now, these neurons, as I mentioned, project to many different regions in the brain. So this still doesn't resolve the issue of how these neurons are enlisting the animal's attention and focus and salivation and so forth to get it in a position where it can get the food or the good stuff. I won't go into detail on this, but the main thing I want to say about this is that all of these circuits are connected, and we're able to look at the anatomical connections between this region and this region and this region and this region, and they're all sort of connected in a circuit. And that circuit goes, roughly speaking, from deep down in the brain up here to your motor cortex, which is up here at the top of your head. So one idea about this circuit is that when you prime it with dopamine, then you get that animal's attention focused on something good and get it moving towards that thing so that it can grab it. And obviously this has adaptive significance, okay? And there's amazing science that's been done in the last 50 years to sort of carefully trace all these pathways, to understand the chemistry of what's going on. And still we don't have a good functional idea of exactly what the circuitry is doing. And this is where brain imaging comes in. So this is where the method that I use a lot, I use behavior quite a bit, and I also use functional magnetic resonance imaging comes in. And the reason that it's useful is because it gives you the temporal resolution on brain activity that is a second-to-second temporal resolution, which means you can look at what's happening in the brain, not just when somebody gets something good, but when they anticipate something good. If you think about going to the supermarket and choosing bread, I always have a hard time choosing bread. I don't know why. But you go to the supermarket and choose bread. You stand there and you see all that stuff. How long does that take? From the moment you got there to the moment you reached out and grabbed some bread. How long would you guys say it takes? 3 or 4 minutes. You're like me. 3 or 4 minutes. Okay. Anybody else? 30 seconds? Okay, well, that's pretty short. 5 seconds, 10 seconds? Yeah, I mean, 2 minutes. Yeah, you guys are out on the end of the distribution, right? Just like me. Because I don't go to the store that much. I should, but I don't. But, most people kind of know what they're looking for, but they have to, scan around, and even when they see it, they have to kind of figure out how to reach up there. The minimum that's going to take is, say, a second or two, right? It's going to take time. It's going to take time. And something has to happen in your brain to allow you to do that. Now, if we had a method that would allow us to look deep in the brain as you're thinking about that and doing it, then we could actually try to predict what you're going to do. Which loaf of bread are you going to reach for, right? Or are you going to get bread at all? So what you actually need is a method that allows you to look deep in the brain on a second-to-second basis, and that's what functional magnetic resonance imaging allows you to do, and that's not something that we could do before 1993. So this is a case of technology actually allowing us to answer questions that we couldn't even address before. And so at the time that functional magnetic resonance imaging became popular, I was at the National Institute of Health. And my advisor told me that we had time, our institute had time on this magnet, and would I like to use it for something? And I was very excited about that. At that time, people were just looking at sort of what I would call input and output. So input being, flashing lights in your eyes and looking at your visual cortex, or output, looking at your motor cortex right before you're about to reach for something, okay? But I realized, and other people realized quickly, that you could look deep in the brain and get at some of these deep areas that we knew very little about. And so what I wanted to do is to get people emotional. I wanted people to get excited or anxious about something, and I used all kinds of different stimuli to try to do this. So just like in the monkey studies or the Pavlovian studies, we tried to use food or juice. That was very difficult. The juice dripped out of the mouth, and it was hard to squirt it into the mouth fast enough, and people swallowed and moved their heads. And I won't go into all the gory details, but we showed them pictures. I'll talk a little bit about pictures later. Turns out people have very different preferences for pictures. So some people like pictures of puppies, others don't. They like surgery or whatever else. So that was tough. And so what we finally hit upon was money. That money really worked pretty well for most of our subjects. Most of our subjects were motivated to try to get money. We could scale it, so we could say, we're either going to give you a little bit or a lot. We could also take it away. That was really great because, that meant then it could either be positive or negative. And this is a really tricky dilemma if you're studying animals, right? So how many shocks does a dog have to overcome to get 3 squirts of food powder? It's incommensurate. But as humans, we have this great invention called money. So we used money, and we didn't just give it to people, but we actually cued them in probably the dumbest video game that's ever been invented, that they might make money, okay? Or they might avoid losing money. And so the way the video game works is people see a cue, they wait a couple of seconds, then they see a rapidly presented target, like a square, that flashes on the screen. They try to push the button before the target goes away. If they're fast enough, depending on what the cue indicates, they could make money. If they're not fast enough, they don't make anything. And if it's another type of a cue, like a square, they can avoid losing money. So if they're fast enough in that case, they would get 0. And if they're not fast enough, they would actually lose money. This is for real money. So we have people come into the lab. We show them the money. We found out that this is very important. As people are like, this is for real money? You just wasted $1,500 on a brain scanning experiment. So we show them the money. We pay that. We dole it out after they get out of the scanner. And they're really engaged in these tasks, and they get emotional about them. I mentioned that we can manipulate the cues, so we can manipulate expectation as well as the outcome. So here we have circles indicating you can make money, squares indicating you can lose money. We can manipulate how much is at stake. No lines means no dollars. We just want you to be a good sport and play along. 1 line means 20 cents is at stake, 2 lines $1, 3 lines $5 is at stake. So this is reasonable money even in Palo Alto. You could probably buy a latte with that or something. So if you were in my magnet, you might see this, and then you would see this, and then you would see that really fast. And if you were fast enough, you would have gotten $5. And I like that response over there because that's what a lot of people do. They're like, woo, I got the $5. Or, oh, I just lost $5. And then you see what happened to your total here. So people play this game as they're in the magnet. And the basic idea here is to use the signal that's in their brain to look at what happens not only in response to getting the money or losing the money, but also when people think they might get the money or they might lose the money. And the other thing I forgot to tell you is that we can control your success rate. So we can track how fast you are, right? And we can make those cues faster or slower depending on how well you're doing, okay? And this is very important. Because we don't want people to know they've already made the money. We want them to not be sure. And we want them to know they've lost the money. We want them not to be sure. And it turns out that it's much more engaging if it's hard but not too hard, as you might readily understand if you're trying to make a game like this. So we basically can track people into performance, like 66% hits, for instance. And this tends to be very engaging for people. So that's how the task works. What do we see when we look inside the brains of people playing this task? And by the way, people are highly engaged. They don't fall asleep. They want to play more, so they come out of the magnet wanting to come back. So it's not hard to get subjects for these experiments. And they're able to keep their heads still, too. So which is important with fMRI. So what we see, and this is, I should point out, this is somebody's head, some nice subject who had a pretty brain. And we took their structural scan, and we cut it here, here, and here, and took the chunk out. So you could look into their brain, and not only at their cortex, but also under their cortex, the subcortical areas. This is about the area that Olds was stimulating in that rat brain, or the rat was stimulating itself. And what we see when people think they can make money, they haven't made anything yet, is increased activity in that area when they think they're going to make money. And we don't see the same increase in activity in that area when they think they're going to lose money. So we think we're onto something. The other reason we think we're onto something is because we know that dopamine is projecting to that area from the animal studies I just told you about. We're not looking at dopamine, we're looking at oxygen, which is a proxy for neurons firing. But we think that dopamine squirts out and probably changes what's going on in that area, the energy utilization. So what we can then do is we can say, okay, show me the data. Show me that before people responded, before they got the money, activity in that region is increasing. That's what fMRI is buying us, right? So this plot is a little complicated, but what it shows is the period when people saw the cues that they could make money. Here's the period where they're waiting to respond. Here's where they responded. Here's where they actually made the money. And what you see here is two things. The more money that people think they can make, here's a $0, 20 cents, $1, and $5 cue, the more activity you see in this region. And also, by the time they've actually made the money, it's going back to baseline. So if you don't have the temporal resolution to look at these stages of what's going on separately, you're going to miss the signal. If you average over this whole thing, you're not going to be able to see very much. The brain is responding fast. It's anticipating things fast, and it's flexible. And that should be no surprise to us, actually. But until we had this technology, we just couldn't see those changes in the signal. But that suggests something else, too, that we could take that signal and now use it to try to predict something that people will do. Before I go on, I just want to tie this back into emotion, because I told you that I was interested in emotion. And even though it seems like we've drifted far from that, I never really lost sight of that. So I'd ask people after they came out of the magnet, when you saw this cue that indicated you make it $5, how good did you feel? How aroused did you feel? How excited did you feel? When you ask people questions like that, you can plot their feeling in a sort of a two-dimensional space of valence and arousal. And you can see how far up, in this case, they go on this dimension that I'll call positive arousal. So this is like being excited, energetic, and so forth. It's what we think should correspond with dopamine release in this area. And what we see is that we're not looking at the money spot per se. We think we're looking at the excitement spot. So if you're a person that's very excited about making $5 and you report that and you see that cue, then you report that you were more excited and you show a bigger nucleus accumbens response. You show a bigger response in that brain area. Okay, so this is a person who is very excited about making $5, and they show a large response in this brain area. Whereas this person, faced with the same cue, wasn't as excited. Said, whatever, I'm rich. Their nucleus accumbens isn't responding the same way. I said I'm rich, but actually it doesn't. We found that wealth doesn't really matter that much. Some rich people are quite motivated, other poor people not so motivated. So. Oh, good question, yeah. So each of these dots is a person as a subject in our study. And this is their excitement only when they're looking at that $5 cue. So this is really the biggest win cue. And then this y-axis indicates how much activity there is in that one area I showed you, the nucleus accumbens, when they see that $5 cue. So each of those dots is a person. And in fact, this task works pretty well, so a lot of people around the world have used it to see this brain area. And there are clinical reasons that you might want to see activity in this area, that you might want to see a neural marker of motivation that I won't go into, but I will say we've had pretty good success with collaborators in psychiatry looking at people with schizophrenia and other disorders where people suffer from deficits in motivation. When they play the same task and we get the same behavior from them, we see blunting of activity in these regions of the brain. And that's correlated with their self-reported amotivational symptoms. And we think this could be a good clue as to which kinds of either pharmacotherapy or psychotherapy these people could benefit from. So there is a clinical angle to this, and that's why I was doing this at the National Institute of Health. But I'm not really focusing on that today. I'm focusing more on moment-to-moment decisions. And I won't go into detail on this. I think I want to get to the prediction part of the talk. But you can change other things about the cue, about the expectation. So you can make people expect there's a high probability they'll win or a low probability. It turns out that's really relevant to a lot of economic ways of thinking about how people should decide, that probability and magnitude go together to form something called expected value, and that you can use it to gamble efficiently too. And it also turns out that many of these regions that dopamine projects to are activated when people expect higher probabilities of making money, but not to the same extent. So it seems that the prefrontal cortex is more attuned to probability, whereas this subcortical region that I just talked about, the nucleus accumbens, is more in tune with magnitude. And the reason that we think this is important is because if you lose your prefrontal cortex, we think that will make you make decisions that may be insensitive to probability. So for instance, that it may make you more likely to play the lottery, where there's a very small probability of winning a very large amount. And I won't go into that anymore, but I just want to point out that there are some clinical implications of this work. So many people have done these studies. Here's a meta-analysis. That means just putting a whole bunch of the same studies together and looking for common patterns. And these patterns are quite robust, actually. Using money in Germany, Japan, England, and so forth. People show the same kinds of responses where you get a bigger activity in this subcortical region, the nucleus accumbens, when people think they can gain money than when they think they can lose money. And there are other regions that we think that are important for anticipating loss. They're not as clear in our data, and there may be physiological reasons for that. We're still working on that. But what this does is it gives us markers. It gives us neural markers for when we think people are anticipating good outcomes and when we think they're anticipating bad outcomes. And armed with those markers, we can start to make predictions, not just about how people will feel, but what they will choose. So this is the prediction part of the talk, right? So we're moving away from the traditional way of thinking about brain imaging, where you show people things and look for correlated activity in their brain. Now what we're saying is, okay, forget what's going in. Let's look at what's happening in their brain, and let's make a prediction about what they're going to do next. One area where we can make these kinds of predictions is financial risk-taking. Another is shopping, and so we'll talk about those next. This is our rough back-of-the-napkin model for what we think is happening. So we think that when people show more activity in certain parts of their brain, like the nucleus accumbens, they will see the upside of a proposition, say a gamble, or even a consumer purchase decision. And when you see activity in other regions, they're going to be paying more attention to potential losses. And depending on the balance of activity in those regions, we can predict whether people are more likely to approach or avoid something. Okay, so that's going to be a theme that's in the second part of the talk about prediction. So I'm going to start actually with probably not the most straightforward example. I'm going to start with financial risk-taking. And the reason I'm going to start with it is because chronologically that's what we started investigating first, because I had a student from finance who decided she wanted to do neuroeconomics research and came up with this really cool study. And she actually wrote it up as a paper in my class, and I said, hey, let's do this, and so we naively did it. But what she wanted to do was simulate investing. And this is not trivial, but she came up with a really interesting task to do this. And in this task, it's sort of a stripped-down version of investing. Basically, you're trying to decide between three options, two risky options, two stocks, and a bond. And you know something about these options, so you know that the good stock is going to pay off $10 with about a 50% probability, but 25% of the time you're going to lose $10. Conversely, the bad stock, you're going to lose $10 50% of the time and gain $10 25% of the time. And the bond, if you choose that, you'll always make $1, okay? And what people do is they choose between these, then they see the outcomes, they learn, hopefully, and then they go to the next trial and they choose again. Okay, and what this test does is it elicits all kinds of behaviors from people. People would choose from the stocks, then maybe they'll go back to the bond, then they'll go back to the stocks again. And what we want to know is what's happening in their brain right before they make these choices. Is there something that happens in their brain that's like a switch that makes them go to the high-risk options rather than the low-risk options, or vice versa? And based on what I've said, you know kind of where we're looking, but I'll review that. So if you were in my magnet, you might see these three options, the two stocks and a bond. You don't know which is the good and which is the bad stock. Say you choose stock T. You wait, and you see that you just made $10, and your total is now $20, okay? You also see, and this is important, that if you would have chosen stock R, you would have made $0. Okay, so that's more information. So that means the next time you choose, that may actually influence what you do next. Okay? Again, what we're interested in is not so much what's happening here when they choose, but what's happening in their brain right before they choose. And the reason we made the task this way is because this task allows you to calculate what a rational actor would do. So, and we mean rational actor in the finance sense of the word. So a risk-neutral Bayesian updating actor. That is somebody with perfect memory, who remembers everything that happened, and is able to weight those events and come up with the optimal solution. Unless you think this is kind of a silly model, this is the kind of model that's used to choose yours and my retirement portfolios, if they still exist. So, you know, this is a commonly accepted model in finance. And it's really cool because what it allows us to do is operationalize rationality and irrationality, right? So we can say, when did people do something that was consistent with the rational actor, and when did they do something that was inconsistent? I won't go into great detail there, and I won't go into great detail here. I just want to make one point, and that is, if you look at what's happening in that nucleus accumbens region, that region that the rats were self-stimulating right before they're about to make a pick, it turns out that if there's more activity in that region, you're more likely to take a risk. And the more activity there is, the more likely you are to take an irrational risk. That is, to choose the stock when the rational actor is not choosing the stock. It's not totally irrational. That is to say, even when you're making a rational, risky choice, there's more activity in the incumbents. Conversely, in this other region that I pointed out that's a little more to the side, the insula, when there's more activity in that region, you're more likely to avoid the risk and just choose the bond. And if there's even more activity in that region, you're more likely to take an irrational risk, make an irrational choice to avoid risk. Okay, so it's almost like there are two levers. One steers you this way, one steers you that way. If you go too far, your forklift turns over. So you kind of need the levers to steer the forklift, but you don't want to go too far one way or the other. Okay. So this tells us some interesting facts. It tells us, we think, that if we're associating what's happening in these regions with emotion, that emotion is really important, actually, for making rational decisions, but there needs to be a balance. And if there's not a balance, you'll become extreme and make irrational decisions. Here's a set of decisions that many of you are probably more familiar with. I know I am. Shopping. This is a set of experiments I did with George Lowenstein, who's a behavioral economist at Carnegie Mellon, and Dražen Prelec, who's at MIT. And this was a very simple experiment. All we wanted to do is get people to shop in the magnet. But again, it's the same idea as before. We want to take their brain activity before they actually make the choice and see if we can use that activity to predict what they're about to do. And you already know where I'm going to be looking in the brain based on what I've said. But what we did is we gave people money, $40, and we said you're going to be looking at 80 products at discounted prices. On each one, you're going to have the opportunity to buy that product at that price or not and indicate that. And at the end of the experiment, we're going to draw 2 of these for real. And we're going to look at what you did. And if you said yes, then you give us the money and we'll give you the product plus change. And if no, you keep the money. So this is what economists call it incentive compatible. So if you're in my magnet, you might see something like this. Then you would see something like that, the price. And then you would have an opportunity to say yes or no. And if you're me, you'll say yes here. But not everybody will. And then you wait, and you go to the next trial. So it's sort of like doing Sky Mall on the magnet or something like that, or Amazon. So what did we see in this experiment? Well, actually, we did see that when people saw products, especially products they liked, we saw more activity in this nucleus accumbens region that I've been talking about that we associate with anticipating gains. But when they saw prices they didn't like, and I can give you more information about how we calculated that, we saw more activity in this insula region. So it's sort of the opposite pattern of activation. And what we also saw is that we could use the brain activation. After the experiment, I'll just rewind a little bit and say, we asked people, which of these products did you like? And they rated each of the products. And we asked them, how much would you be willing to pay for each of the products? What we could do is then subtract how much they were willing to pay from the price they saw and get what I call a bargain versus rip-off metric. But an economist would call it a consumer surplus metric. And we were able to correlate both of those with brain activation. And we found that those two things did a good job of predicting what people would want to buy or not. But if we just took that data and threw it away and just looked at what was happening in the brain, in these 3 regions, the nucleus accumbens, a part of the prefrontal cortex, and the insula, we also found we could significantly predict whether people were going to buy something or not. So this is before they've indicated their choice. And we also found that when you put these 2 things together, the self-report and the brain activity, the self-report doesn't rule out the significance of the brain activity. So this is a situation where people's self-report and brain activity is actually correlated, as we've shown. But there might be situations where there's not a correlation. So for instance, when people encounter something novel that they've never bought before, or maybe they have conflicted desires about something like a hamburger, but they're on a diet, and so forth. So these are instances that Kelly's writing about in her new book that you should buy, but others are starting to look at, and those are much more interesting. But here we were just trying to ask the question, can we use the brain activation to predict what people are going to do? And the answer is yes. And it doesn't matter if we focus on these specific areas that I talked about, or we use data from the whole brain at each time point to predict what people are going to do. So here's a whole brain method that basically doubles our prediction rate with the same data. And what we see is that when people see products, the area that predicts that they're going to buy something is this nucleus accumbens area. Once they see the price, boom, you see the cortex get engaged. You see that these areas in the prefrontal cortex that we think are doing a cost-benefit balance are predicting now, and this other area we weren't paying attention to in the posterior cingulate that we think has something to do with attention. And by the time they've actually made the choice, when they're making the choice, the predictive power is gone. So this is all happening before. This is all happening in your brain seconds before you make a choice. And I can't stress enough that the technological advances are actually critical for us to see this. Now, since we did this not so long ago, in 2007, a number of other labs have found similar results and have found other interesting things. So, for instance, they found that even if you distract people... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Did you actually ask people what they experienced the milliseconds before they made their choices?
We did ask them in a way. So we asked them how much they preferred each product, and then we asked them how willing they were to pay each price. But we didn't ask how they were feeling, which would be very interesting, I think. So that's something we'd like to look at.
Why didn't you do that?
Because we have to do them separately. If we ask them in the magnet, then we believe that the reflective processing will impinge upon the activation that we're seeing and might change it. So it's sort of like a Heisenberg uncertainty principle issue, that by reflecting on the very process you're studying, you actually change the process. And there's some evidence for that, actually. So that if you're in an emotional episode, especially one of these anticipatory affective states, and you get people to reflect, then it actually starts to change what's going on. So one way to do that would be before the experiment to ask people, how are they reacting to everything? But we didn't want to bias their choices. We just wanted it to be as naturalistic as possible. And that's why we asked them after the experiment. But of course, these are all interesting questions that need to be explored. And some of them have to do with how aware are you of what's going on, even emotionally. And maybe that most people aren't aware until the experimenter comes with their clipboard and says, how did you feel when you saw that product, And I suspect that's probably the case because, remember, these are regions of the brain that we share, for the most part, with rats and dogs and monkeys and so forth, who may be somewhat reflective, but not to the same extent that humans are. And in fact, that's relevant to these replications where investigators distracted people and showed them things that they might buy, like auto cars in Germany and so forth, and were able to derive the same prediction regardless of what people were specifically attending to. There's an interesting set of issues also, not just about how much conscious reflection is required, but also about even if you can do this in individuals, does it scale to the aggregate? So that is to say, could you use some focus group of people in the magnet and their preferences to make inferences about the market? And one really provocative example of this is by Greg Burns, who will be speaking here probably in this room on Wednesday, where they looked at people's neural responses to songs that were on MySpace, I believe. It was MySpace. It was a defunct social network. Or maybe not yet. But, and then 3 years later, they looked at market data. They looked at RIAA ratings of these songs. And were able to use, actually, the nucleus accumbens response to these clips of these songs to predict which songs would be the hits. So that's pretty crazy. But it suggests that at least some of these processes may scale to the aggregate. These are obviously hard studies to do, and that needs to be replicated. What are the implications of not only understanding how brain activity is correlated to what's out there, but also how it can predict what we're going to do? And I think there are many. Some of the theoretical implications are that we may be able to construct a theory of decision-making that A, involves emotion, and B, goes beyond the theories that we have so far. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that briefly. So for instance, many of theories of finance consider the expected value of a stock. So that means how well it did in the past, and how well you think it's going to do in the future. And also the variance, the variability in that stock. So if it's going up and down and up and down, most people tend not to want that to happen. So they'll pay to have stability in their stocks. But they don't consider things like skewness. And this is another statistical property of stocks. So skewness means that you might have the stock rise to a very high value, but it only does that once, right? So this means actually very high magnitude, low probability events, like I mentioned the lottery earlier. Only one person's going to win the lottery. They're going to win a lot of money, but it's very unlikely that it's going to be you. And so the expected value of that lottery ticket is probably negative when you buy it, okay? mathematically. But yet people buy lottery tickets, okay? People gamble. People do this stuff. So why? Why do they do that? There isn't really a great finance theory that can account for this behavior. And Nicholas Nassim Taleb has talked about skewness and kurtosis and higher statistical moments in his book, The Black Swan. You might have heard of that. Because there was a sort of an outlier, a skewed or kurtotic event that occurred just not so long ago in the financial markets where there was, I don't even understand fully exactly what happened, but basically there were over-leveraged types of options, and there was basically a devaluing of those options, and there was a financial crisis around the world that we're still recovering from. So to try to illustrate this more concretely, consider these gambles. Let's say I offer you this gamble right here. You have this amount of chance of, I've got a spinner, of making $1.75, but you have this amount of chance of losing $5.25. How many of you would take that gamble? Good. We have at least one person. Good. Thank you. Okay, good. Okay, how about this gamble? 50% chance of winning $3.05 and 50% chance of losing $3.05. How many would take that gamble? Great, more of you. Okay, good, good. So I'd say, you know, about 10% or less. How about this gamble? Yeah, this amount of chance of making $5.25, but this amount of chance of losing $1.75 chance. How many would take that gamble? Okay, even more. Not that many more, but like 20%. Some of you are kind of like, maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. Okay, good. So it turns out these gambles are mathematically equivalent. Their expected value is 0, okay? And that's just math. I mean, I'm not tricking you when I say this, okay? But it turns out that this is the kind of preference that most people have. Most people prefer this gamble to that gamble. This is a positive skewed gamble because it has a low likelihood positive outcome, and this is a negative skewed gamble, low likelihood negative outcome. But these are all mathematically equivalent, okay? So if you know that and you're a trader, you can arbitrage that. You can trade against that, basically. And people do. There are instruments that trade against this. But that's not the point I'd like to make. The point I'd like to make is that we've just done an experiment where we put people in the magnet and we asked them, would you like to take this gamble or not? Either you take this gamble or you just get 0. That's it. And we look at what happens in their brain before they do that. And when we do that, lo and behold, we are able to predict that more people will take this gamble because there's more nucleus accumbens activation before they take it. Why? Because they're focused on that gain. They're not thinking about probability. That's what we think is going on, and they're excited. This is not the case when they choose this gamble. So we don't see as much activity, and in fact, we start to see deactivation of the insula. We can also predict individual risk preferences. Some people who raise their hands really like this gamble. Those people are going to have more nucleus accumbens activation before they choose that gamble. All I'm trying to illustrate here is that we can use this data to go beyond the extant theories and maybe make a more comprehensive theory that can actually explain and predict human choice. Here's another weird example. This is far out. So in this experiment, we asked people to choose between a low and a high-risk gamble. And by that I mean one gamble is a 50-50 chance of making or losing 10 cents. And this gamble is a 50-50 chance of winning or losing $1. And they just chose this over and over again. But the trick was we also put pictures in front of the gambles. Okay? And there were 3 kinds of pictures that we put in front of the gambles. One type was erotic, tamed by our internet standards, right? But couples making out, sort of not fully clothed. Another set of pictures was snakes and spiders, basically. And a third set of pictures was of office supplies. Okay, so you can immediately sense that, you know, the heterosexual college students who are males that were in our study liked these pictures, the erotic pictures, better than the snakes and spiders or the office supplies, obviously. And so what was our hypothesis? Well, our hypothesis was, let's trick the system. Let's jack that nucleus accumbens response and make the gain salient. And if we do that, then people are going to take the high-risk gamble. Why? Because it has a bigger gain. It has a bigger loss, too, but that's not what they're paying attention to. So indeed, that's what we saw. And not only did we see that, but we also saw that those people who were really susceptible to this influence, when they saw the sexy picture, they took the risky gamble, had more activation in their nucleus accumbens right after they saw the sexy picture and before they took the risky gamble. So this is some statistical evidence that there's some sort of a pathway through your brain that can trick your brain, really, because these are again, the expected value of these gambles is always 0. And by the way, it's the same person, it's the same gamble, and they're flipping around their choices, right? So it doesn't make any sense from an economic standpoint, but yet we can predict and manipulate this, okay? And we're not doing this because we're nefarious and we're trying to manipulate people, but we're doing this because we think this is how the system works. And so in order to test our theory, we actually have to go in there and show that we can change things. All right, so just to summarize everything I've said, we think that neural activity related to anticipatory affect, so that's the kind of emotion that you would feel when you're anticipating an outcome, an uncertain outcome. We can localize it with fMRI, but not only that, we can use it to predict decisions. Financial decisions, at least, and we think other kinds of decisions too, like social decisions. These predictions extend beyond those made by standard economic and psychological theories, we believe. And so they could pave the way to having a better theory of how people make decisions and a better self-understanding of our idiosyncrasies in making decisions. That's our hope. There are so many questions that are unanswered. There are more questions than answers at this point. So for instance, can other circuits, so sort of your habits you formed, maybe symbolic systems, rule-based systems in your brain, override these systems? When do they do that? Do they have to act through these emotional circuits, or can they go around them? We don't know. We have the tools, though, to start asking these questions. Can the individual influences that we see here scale to the group level, and if so, when? And this would obviously have implications not only for psychology, but also for economics. So in closing, this lecture was actually not supposed to be about my work, although it was. I apologize for that. It was supposed to be about thinking like a psychologist, so I just want to end on that. Chances are you're all thinking like psychologists, and almost everybody out there is. How can we avoid it, right? You know, we observe what other people are doing, we describe what they are doing, maybe to other people, we come up with explanations. But the difference is, if you want to think like an experimental psychologist, you have to go the extra mile. So you have to not just say, okay, I believe in the rational actor, that's my explanation, done. That's how people either are or should be. And you can't say, I think people are emotional, and that's all that matters. Okay, that just doesn't lead anywhere. You know, you actually have to say, okay, there are different theories here. I may not be right. I may not be right about this emotional thing. Maybe people are rational. Let's actually test our prediction. And if it's not, if we're not right, then we need to revise our prediction, because only then can we actually control and apply what we've learned to ourselves and to the real world. And with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators, Camelia Kunin, Charlene Wu, and Peter Bossert. These are my finance collaborators, George Lowenstein and Dražen Prelec, who are essential for the shopping work, my lab, which is just fantastic. It's here. I love them to death. And my funding agencies and you for sitting through this very long talk. Thank you.
Okay, so over the break, I did hear there were some questions about how do we stop corporations from manipulating us in evil, nefarious ways, but I thought I would start with something a little bit lighter. Maybe we'll get to that. Your research has been very influential for me, and some people here know I have a bit of a shopping addiction. And you know, the first time that I saw your research about both the shopping study and also about how dopamine surges when you're anticipating getting a reward, and then it starts to go down as soon as you actually get it. I realized that I could actually maximize my happiness online shopping by looking at everything I could buy, putting it in my cart, super exciting, dopamine, dopamine, dopamine. But if I actually went to buy it, that's when the insula would kick in, and I'm like, it's gonna cost so much, the pain. So now, if I want that little bit of dopamine boost, I just go internet shopping, and I just leave it all in my cart and don't check out.
That's exactly what I do.
Is it really?
Yeah, I do that, yeah. You should see my Amazon shopping cart.
I know.
It's a lot of stuff.
Here's another little trick.
It's been there a long time, too.
If you do that, they send you coupons, too.
Oh.
So it's actually, it's a little bit of strategic. But so that's how you think like a psychologist, apparently. Okay.
Window shopping, too.
Yeah, exactly. Window shopping is way more fun.
As long as you don't bring your kids.
Yeah, because then their nucleus accumbens will just be like, buy me, buy me.
They won't have the prefrontal inhibition to stay outside.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So I want to actually get a little bit more into this idea that the juice is in the anticipation. And one of the most interesting distinctions that I've seen made as an extension of your original research, showing that the dopamine is really surging in anticipation, is this distinction between wanting something and liking it.
Yes, yeah,
and how there is not always a good correlation between this activation of dopaminergic neurons that make you think something really good is going to happen. And so you have this inner experience of wanting it, not always correlated with the system of actually being happy or receiving pleasure after the fact. And it has struck me that in our culture, we are so convinced by the wanting experience that sometimes we don't pay any attention at all to whether it correlates with the liking or the satisfaction or the happiness that we are predicting is going to happen.
So there's sort of two angles that I think of to respond to your comment when I think of what you're saying. One is sort of the physiological level. So there are these amazing rat studies by Kent Berridge that you've probably heard of. He's a psychologist, psychobiologist at the University of Michigan. And we were talking about facial coding, actually, off the stage there. Well, he does facial coding on rats. So he'll look at rats when he gives them a cue that they will receive something tasty, like sugar water.
Can you show them the
Well, he
goofy
usually puts them
smile?
on plexiglass, and then they have these big snouts, and so you can see their mouths. But if you were to put sugar in a rat's mouth, then they would make a, kind of a licking expression like that. And if you put something bitter like quinine, they would go like that, which babies do, people do too, right? Babies do too. And they've done these experiments on babies, and they have videotapes of this. So he actually codes their faces. And the reason he codes their faces is because then he can manipulate the dopamine in their brain or the opioids in their brain. It's a different neurotransmitter. And his idea is that dopamine is more involved in this sort of what we would call appetitive motivation. So appetitive motivation is like when Pavlov's dogs hear the dishes clanking, they salivate, and they orient, and they look ahead, and they, if you have a dog, you know what I'm talking about, and they wag their tail and all that. Whereas the consummatory motivation is more about getting this food powder, licking it up, kind of enjoying the taste of the food powder. And by manipulating these different neurotransmitters, he can actually enhance the rat's appetitive behavior. So they're lip smacking and licking before they get the reward. Actually, it's not so much the lip smacking as just the eating itself. And once they've gotten that tasty reward, they'll smack their lips quite a bit. And he can separately manipulate that with another neurotransmitter called opioids. These are the kinds of, it's a peptide neurotransmitter, but it's the kind of neurotransmitter that is influenced by drugs like heroin, morphine, and so forth. And these drugs, and presumably this neurotransmitter in your brain, because your brain makes an endogenous, its own version of this, makes people feel good, but in a very different way. It makes them feel calm and relaxed and good, as opposed to dopamine, which when injected into certain regions of your brain will increase this appetitive behavior, this feeling good and excited. So Kent's done beautiful work on that, looking at just not only the neurochemistry, but sort of the outward expressions of appetitive versus consummatory motivation, and try to disentangle them.
Before you go into your second extension of that, what I think is so fascinating is that there's this whole field of neuromarketing that is explicitly trying to manipulate the anticipatory response, the dopamine, even though it may not be doing anything to increase actual pleasure, so that you can be manipulated into the wanting when you're in the store, and then you get home, and whatever it is you've bought or you've eaten may not actually deliver on any of the pleasure.
Right. You could argue that marketers have always been doing that.
Yes.
But now they have
they're
sort of a
putting
neural
people in the
terms for
brain
it,
scanners and testing which advertisement or which smell is going to release the most dopamine.
Yeah, as people say they're doing this, but then I never know whether to believe this stuff or not. So we'll go on another tangent about this probably. Okay. But as a consumer of information, like if you're reading the New York Times or something, and somebody makes some claim, like somebody did recently 2 weeks ago or so, there was a guy named Martin Lindstrom who wrote a book called Biology, and he said, I did the largest neuromarketing study using brain imaging, and I found that your brain is in love with your iPhone because I saw the insula was activated. And to make a long story short, nobody knows whether he did this study or not because it hasn't been published. And nobody can look at the data and evaluate it, okay? So This is problematic from a scientific standpoint, maybe not from a marketing standpoint. So it's really, when people make these claims, it's really hard to know who's doing the studies, what have they found, does it replicate, that is, can you reproduce it, and so forth. Unless it's peer-reviewed, right, and hopefully replicated by other people, I would just say buyer beware. So I mean, that was a bit of a tangent, but I think it's an important thing for people to know about the claims that are being made in the media, because it is true that we're able to do things now that we weren't able to do 10 years ago. I would have never in my wildest dreams thought we could look into the brain and actually predict what choice somebody's going to make. And so that generates excitement, but it also generates hype.
So speaking about media, I remember when when the sexy photos study first came out, the study that you show men sexy images and they make more risky investments. I remember there was a lot of media reports that were saying it was because of some evolutionary reason, that when men think sex, they want to go out and they're going to take chances to get their mating opportunity. And I remember you being really irritated by that interpretation of the finding, that it wasn't really consistent with your study or your scientific interpretation. And I just wonder, in general, do you think that the media gets your research or research in general right?
Well, I'm so happy you asked that question, because we have data right now showing that it's a follow-up to that study, where instead of using pictures, we use smells. Because I was commenting to somebody who came up afterwards, they were saying, well, what about women? Did you see the same thing with women? And the honest answer is no, we did not. So we weren't seeing women get as excited by the erotic photos.
They might have by the office supplies.
Well, maybe I didn't use the right red stapler, but we just couldn't get the same affective response. And so, you know, I stewed about it, and meanwhile, these media reports came out, and there were basically two interpretations. One is it's about the emotion. So if you get the right emotion, you're going to get this risk-taking behavior. Another is it's some evolutionarily conserved module of the brain that, you know, males see sexy women and they take risks because they want to look attractive to the women. Never mind that it's a photograph and they've never met that woman before, and they're never going to meet her again.
Mate too, so that, you know, your opportunities. But
you know, it's a reasonable hypothesis in a way. It's something you could test. I just didn't think it was right. So now what we've done is we've used smells, and it turns out both men and women really like good smells and really hate bad smells. Mm-hmm. And by good smells I mean vanilla, and by bad smells I mean garbage and onion oil and stuff like that. And so we've actually used those smells in that same paradigm, and we see, I think, I'm going on tape, so hopefully this will pan out the way I think, the same kinds of changes in the behavior of both men and women. So if I'm right, that's what should happen. If you see the same emotional change, you should see the same effect on behavior, basically. So I don't want to go on record saying this, but I'll say there's a high probability that my interpretation was correct.
But we'll wait till it's peer-reviewed.
Yeah, I mean, but I will say that, you know, for the most part, we've had really good experiences with the media, and I think part of it has to do with just understanding what the media wants, so that they want a soundbite. And I'm not saying that in a derogatory way at all, that's how the information is conveyed. So it's better if you provide that than somebody else does. And what happened in that case is somebody else provided sound bites. And you know, there are also, there's an amazing array of scientific media right now that I think is really great stuff. And so if you talk to those people, they are interested in getting the story right and fact-checking. There are outlets where they don't have a reputation for scientific veracity, and we tend to avoid those outlets.
Mm-hmm. You want to give us a clue to what those are? You don't have to, because this is all going to be on.
I'll let you surf the net and find out for yourself.
I want to ask you about something you opened your talk with, this distinction between the rational actor and the less rational actor. And you suggested that wisdom might be becoming more aware of what our irrational biases are. Daniel Kahneman just published a book. I think it's called Thinking Fast and Slow. Anyone have it yet? Have you read it? I think it's supposed to be a really good book. Anyways, one of the leading behavioral economists. And he has pointed out that despite spending decades studying how it is that he himself is irrational and how all humans are irrational when making decisions, that awareness hasn't done a whole lot to improve the quality of his decision making. And I thought that was like quite amazing that he would cop to that. And I was wondering what you think about that. Has your own research increased your awareness as a consumer or as an investor? Or in general, do you think that knowing about these biases really is enough?
I don't think knowledge is enough, unfortunately. I think it's a first step. But then I think you have to apply the knowledge in a way that's effective. And that's not always straightforward, either on an individual level or on a policy level. And so I actually think that's why we need research. both on an individual and policy level. So I think the knowledge is important to give you clues on what to intervene in. But because so much of this is happening so fast, I think under the radar of consciousness, conscious reflection, even if you're aware of it, it's going to usually be after it's happened. So there are things that I do to game myself. So for instance, I have an iPhone. I'm terrible about time. I'm like an anticipatory person. And so I get engaged in things. And so I have it alarm me when I need to go to the next appointment. It's a really dumb hedge, but it works. And it has changed my life for the better, although it's not a perfect solution. I'm sure there must be many other solutions like that people could think, if I had a prefrontal cortex when I was doing this, here's how I'd set up the situation, right, to facilitate the long-term behavior that I want.
So we need to build a prefrontal cortex in our environment. So you support the idea of nudges.
That's what computers are, right?
Yeah.
I mean, well, not the only thing, but I think one reason to have a computer, I think these are like prosthetics, basically. And I don't if you've read who's the guy that wrote Neuromancer? Anyways, there's science fiction out there. William Gibson, yeah. So he talks about people putting chips in behind their ears and their heads, and that kind of thing. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I think these kinds of prosthetics.
There's a market opportunity right there.
Well, this is me drinking the Silicon Valley water, but I can't help it, right? I'm here. So there will be prosthetics like this, not just for arms and things like that, but for foresight, and for. And I don't just mean that you wear on your head, but in your environment and so forth. We'll see if that happens.
So speaking of the market, the last thing I want to ask you about is this company, Consumerology.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what it is they're doing and how they're using research to help people?
Yeah, so I joked at the beginning of the talk that I was the last person to be interested in money. And so now I'm an advisor for this board that is called Consumerology. And I just always find it amazing when academic research is in any way of interest or applicable to the real world. So what happened is this company, Express Scripts is what they're called, is basically an internet pharmacy. And what they found a very basic thing actually, that very simple, what they call behavioral economic modifications could vastly change people's behavior, basically to improve their health. So basically what they could do is sign people up for a default program or not. They could give them the option of signing up for this program. To receive medications in the mail. And what they found is that if you get medications in the mail, I'm not saying you can't go to the pharmacy, but it enhances adherence. And so they found just by changing these defaults, many more people were adhering to their medication. And they found a similar thing with switching to generics, right? So if people were sort of default switched, they were more likely to switch. They saved the consumer money and obviously the company, them money too. I don't know if other people maybe not. But the point is that they're interested in why is it that these really, they had economists on board, they were making all these projections, they were unable to predict or account for these kinds of massive shifts in behavior, right? And so they started getting interested in behavioral economics, and they called a bunch of people. One of them was Alan Garber, who was here. He's now the provost at Harvard. Another is Dan Ariely, who you might have heard of. He's a psychologist, behavioral economist. A bunch of people like this, David Laibson, who I was mentioning earlier, an economist. All these people are interested in this intersection between psychology and economics and how to actually affect behavioral change in a useful way that will help both the consumer and the company. And so basically what they do is they invite us to talk to each other for a day, once or twice a year. And I signed up because I thought, I can talk to David, I can talk to Dan, I can talk to Alan, it'll be so great, So, and it works actually. They just have us brainstorm about behavioral economics.
And they translate that into things
They have a lab now, and they're looking at data and tracking all this data, and looking at sort of behavioral bottlenecks, basically. One thing that they're really concerned about is medication adherence. That's a big problem. So you may know what the disease is, know what the treatment is, and yet people don't take their meds, so they don't get treated. And it's bad for everyone because it has a long-term cost. So they're trying to figure out, okay, how can we help people to remember to take their meds, or what are the other issues that come up?
Cool. So I'm going to turn it over to this group now, and I'll let you call on people as you like.
In your data, you showed that the anticipatory response is higher than when you actually get the reward.
Mm-hmm.
So is that universally applicable for any pleasure experience? And does that actually lead to
We don't really know. I mean, so that's a very sort of Oh, yeah, sorry, I'll repeat the question, yeah. So in the first experiment that I described, where people thought they could make money and then they made it, what we see is actually a bigger signal in the nucleus accumbens. Whoops, okay. A bigger signal in the nucleus accumbens. I can turn this off if you want. Because I speak loudly, so. Oh, cool. Before people make the money. So it's really strange from a certain perspective. It's like, why should you get more excited before you've actually made the money? I mean, from an expected value standpoint, that doesn't make any sense at all. That number is lower because it's cut by the probability. But from an affective standpoint and from an evolutionary standpoint, I think it makes sense. Because when you should be the most motivated and energized is when you're about to get that thing. You want to seal the deal. Once you have it, it's a bird in the hand. So the question is, to what extent does that generalize to other scenarios? And the answer is we do not know. So we're starting to branch out into financial risk-taking, shopping. We've seen it happen in those situations. The signal happens before the choice. And happens before people even know what their choice is going to be. Because sometimes, when they haven't seen the price is too high, so they say no. Sometimes it's not, they say yes. And yet, this independently will help predict that they're going to choose that item. So we're pretty sure that in many generalizable circumstances, even social decision-making, am I going to trust this person or not? Am I going to cooperate with that person or not? That you're going to see these signals before, and they will allow you to make certain predictions about what people are going to do. But we don't know how broadly it generalizes. Oh, yes, and then, okay, yeah. And then.
I wanted to know more how you would describe effective gambling.
Effective gambling.
Or efficient, sorry, you said efficient.
Oh, yeah, right. So this goes back to a really old story about the concept of expected value, which is like the cornerstone of decision theory. And a guy named Pascal and Fermat were corresponding in letters. Blaise Pascal was hired by an Italian gambler who was throwing dice, and he wanted to know how to bet on the dice. And this is a really weird notion for some of us because we've been raised to think that probability is always multiplied by magnitude, and that's how you get expected value, and that's how you should decide, right? So according to that framework, in a dice game, you should multiply the amount you can win by the likelihood that you'll win it, right? And if another dice game offers either better odds or better magnitude of the outcome, that product is higher. You should choose that dice game, right? So you can choose between gambles. And you can choose how much to gamble. But it turns out that until Pascal came up with this, people didn't really think about probability, and they certainly didn't factor it in a formal way into their decisions. So now this cornerstone it came about sort of in the mid-14th or 15th century, and was a construct of the Enlightenment, basically. So now that it's widely accepted, though, that if you're choosing between different uncertain options, you don't want to just think about how great the outcome is, but also how likely that outcome is. If you multiply those two numbers together, whatever option has the highest product is the one you should choose. So that's what I mean by choosing optimally, according to an expected value framework.
So the efficient part is based on the odds?
Oh, sorry, yeah, I was using that loosely, but I just meant sort of if you want to assess a whole bunch of uncertain possible outcomes and choose among them. According to expected value theory, this is the way you should do it. You just say, okay, what's the magnitude and probability of this, that, the other, whatever's highest, you pick that one. That's an efficient way to decide. Oh, sorry.
Schizophrenia is a response that most people would where the part of the brain was lighting up in the anticipation with the dopamine. So does that finding have any impact on future clinical treatment of people with, say, schizophrenia or anxiety or OCD, anything like that? Is there any kind of relationship?
Yeah, we think there might be. This is work that's mainly in collaboration with Andreas Heinz, who's a psychiatrist in Berlin. And what he's done is he's run these studies on a bunch of different samples of schizophrenics. Some first episode never had medications in their lives. And that's the sample that I was talking about there. So even though they've not had any medication or intervention, you see this blunting of the nucleus accumbens response. And you also see that correlates with the extent to which they complain that they have no motivation, like they can't get out of bed and everything's flat to them. So what he then did is he treated them. So he treated them with conventional drugs to treat schizophrenia, many of which block dopamine receptors. And you can imagine that that may not help the situation very much. And in fact, you see the same profile in those patients. So you see a blunted nucleus accumbens response when they're anticipating reward. You see a correlation with amotivational symptoms. But then he treated them with other drugs that didn't have the pronounced effects on the postsynaptic dopamine receptors, sorry to get technical, but that didn't have the same pronounced effect in blocking those receptors. And in those patients, he could actually start to see nucleus accumbens activation. And the activity was no longer correlated with these amotivational symptoms. So there's this notion that, even though it's early days, that maybe you could rationally select medications for people depending on their symptom profile using these kinds of probes. Instead of just putting people on whatever the first line medication is, waiting for 3 weeks, saying, that didn't work out so well for you, let's try the next thing. I think it also validates the symptom profile, because I don't think many people would do this, but you might be tempted to say, well, it's all in their mind, or why aren't they motivated? Well, it's just because they've never had a decent job, or but there's actually a marker that is consistent with their experience. And it turns out those amotivational symptoms are in some ways much more debilitating than the psychotic symptoms that schizophrenics often have, because they keep them from functioning at jobs and continuing their livelihoods.
What about like hoarders? Like people who hoard stuff but then even hoard money?
Yeah.
Could it help those kind of people as well?
It's possible. I mean, there's a really interesting dialogue in psychiatry right now about how one should diagnose disorders and then assign treatments. And the traditional way is to go to a book called the DSM-4, and there are categories, and you look at symptoms and you say you have this, you have OCD, or you have schizophrenia, and what you usually use for that is this medication. But there's a movement to use these kinds of phenotypic markers and also symptom profiles, so maybe some subset which goes across different diagnoses, and use that to assign the treatment or medication. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next, I would say, 25 years in terms of the diagnostic framework.
I was just reading the other day about a technique for helping to decide if you want to make a purchase or not, which is just to imagine a stranger either offering you the item you might purchase or the cash value of that purchase. And I'm wondering how things like that, like little tricks like that, or willpower in general, factor into the brain scan in that, like, if you were looking at the brain while trying to make a decision about a purchase, and part of it lights up because you're like, all excited about the item, and then you think about your credit card debt or whatever, and where would that fall, and what would that look like?
Well, we haven't looked at that, but you could see how the methods that we use could be extended to different scenarios. One situation we've looked at is something called the endowment effect. And the endowment effect is an effect, it's pretty robust actually, where if you own something and I ask to buy it, you're going to request a higher amount than you would normally offer to buy that item. So basically, when people own things, they value it at about twice the cost. and this can get people into trouble, because if they're trying to sell a house or something like that, then they might need an intermediary because they're so attached to everything in the house. But people don't really understand why that happens. I mean, it doesn't make economic sense. In other words, there's a theorem, the Coase theorem, that states that states of ownership should not influence the value of something. So for instance, like a Picasso should be worth the same amount whether it's owned by a Nazi or whether it's owned by a French nobleman, even though it probably doesn't, right? But the idea is that items have inherent value that don't depend on the owner. Well, that's not how people treat their items, okay? And I could actually do an experiment in this classroom right now. I could say, all the people from here on over get mugs, all you guys get pins, okay, and now that you've had those, who wants to trade? And usually when I do that experiment, less than 10% of the people raise their hands, okay, which doesn't make sense if your preferences are randomly distributed around the room, okay, and the items are of roughly equal value. But it works every time. It works in Psych 1. It's a great demonstration. You have to trust me on this. So that's an example of the endowment effect. And nobody really knows whether it's because you love the thing so much more because you own it and you really appreciate its good qualities, or you just can't stand the thought of losing it. Like it's actually painful to think of giving that thing up. So we've done some research that leads us to think it's the latter explanation as opposed to the former. So you can imagine how you could use this kind of research to sort of deconstruct different components of purchasing and or selling decisions. But that's just an example. It's not really directly relevant to what you said, but somebody might figure that out. So it would be an interesting avenue for future research. I've been biased over here, so I'll go over here.
Is there a way to get your brain to release more dopamine?
Man, everybody wants that, huh?
Good smell.
Yeah. You know, the funny thing is that there are probably many ways. And so obviously dopamine wasn't put there to respond to cocaine, even though it does. And so, you know, it's probably to help us to negotiate the social world and, you know, to get good stuff and survive. And so there are probably all kinds of natural stimuli. Like I talked about smells, for instance, and pleasant smells. Pleasant taste just a little bit, you know, like the salty peanut effect where you eat a little bit of a good thing and then you want more of it. So there are probably a lot of different situations that will elicit dopamine release, depending on who you are and what your preferences are. Drugs will elicit dopamine release, but bad things can happen. So if you keep doing it, you can deplete your dopamine, basically. The brain acts as if it's a very limited resource. And as far as we know it is, we don't know a lot about actually how to conserve it or you know, how to protect it. So that there are a lot of interesting questions that revolve around that. So my hope is that I'm giving you sort of not a great answer. I'm sort of saying, well, lots of things we don't really know what. But with these kinds of methods, we could actually figure that out. You know, we could say, okay, let's say, why don't you do this after you've run for 5 miles, you know, and see what happens. I don't know if our methods are that precise right now, but I think eventually they will be quite precise. And so you can imagine trying to enhance well-being, and not just the consumatory well-being of, you know, having eaten a lot of cheeseburgers, but the sort of anticipatory well-being, which I think is what really motivates us and makes life worth living. So, to be continued. So, way back there.
Can you explain how good smells would increase risk?
Well, we think, and we don't have the data yet. We know that they can, so we have that data, but we haven't put people in the magnet to look at what's going on in their brain. But our best hypothesis is that those good smells are acting on the same circuitry that I mentioned that were responding to the pleasant images. And that they're invoking that kind of anticipatory affective feeling, that kind of excited feeling. So they're acting through affect, if you will, to then heighten people's awareness of the potential gains in the environment. So when they see that gamble, even though the gamble hasn't changed, right, they're sort of focused on the gains. So they like feel lucky, to put it colloquially. And then they're more likely to go for that. That's our sort of mechanistic hypothesis of what we think is happening. Well, the gambles are really used as just a tool to get at this decision process. So there could be other kinds of decisions that one could make, like do you want to trust this random person you just met, for instance? That's also a risk. They could be nice, they could be nasty, you don't know. So the gambles are just a convenient experimental way for us to get at that. So we suspect it generalizes to other decisions. But yeah, I mean, if we look at, in our lab experiments, if we look at how women and men gamble in our experiments, we don't see huge differences. So at least in our experiments, we don't. So I'll go over here and then, yeah.
What about music? Is it harder to use because there are more individualistic responses than, say, smell would be more universal?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's really fun actually right now in the research because so many people have gotten these methods and looked at so many different things. So some people are looking at music. There are researchers at McGill, Robert Satori and Blood, a researcher who may be coming here next year, all have looked at music that people like. And it is very idiosyncratic. So it's hard to work with. It's also dynamic. So that makes it also tricky in the brain imaging setup to work with. On the other hand, there are some really cool markers of emotional responses with music. So for instance, chills are a physiological sensation that you can actually measure with EMG that some people experience in music. Often when it's music that's highly pleasurable to them, that's deeply significant. And I'm trying to think of her name. I'll think of it, but it's a woman from Robert Zatori's lab who's looked at chills in the magnet, right, and what's happening in their brain. And lo and behold, when people feel chills, you see nucleus accumbens activity. And it does correlate with how pleasurable they report the music being. So there is some indication that even though there's such idiosyncrasy in how people respond to music, that when they do, there's some linkage with these substrates. Somebody up here had a question, yeah.
Yeah, this is related to the previous question.
Oh, okay.
If you expose the brain to multiple influences, say the smell or some visual stimulants, pictures,
Mm-hmm.
and then you do your experiment about risk-taking, I mean, how can your brain be multiplexed with these different influences? Isn't it, if you're distracted with one, then the decision on a secondary matter is kind of affected by the first one, or can your brain really be multiplexed and
Right.
independently?
Well, so there's a question about sort of multisensory input. So, we might be smelling something, tasting something else, seeing something. There's lighting, and you ate something for dinner, and all of that is somehow influencing maybe what you're about to do. And how does it all get combined? And one answer is maybe it doesn't. Maybe it just sort of all has an independent effect on the decision you're about to make. But another hypothesis is there's some common currency type of calculations going on in your brain. So your brain's sort of deciding, well, things are pretty good right now, or things are not so good. And if that's true, then there should be regions or a circuit that is sort of integrating those inputs into a hedonic representation, if you will. And so that's kind of our working theory, is that even if you're not paying attention to things, sometimes they might influence how you feel and might make it to this common currency representation. But it is true that what you're paying attention to obviously will probably have a greater impact on how you feel than what you're not paying attention to. Although there's some interesting evidence that things can get in under awareness or when presented subliminally and influence these subcortical regions of the brain.
We heard last week another experiment where people had to remember 2-digit numbers and 5-digit numbers.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
They were busy with that, and then
Yeah.
they were exposed to another question about choosing chocolate cake or fruit salad. And there, the outcome of the experiment was they were so distracted by the first task, they would blindly, do the second task.
Choose a chocolate cake. Yeah. This is Baba Shiv's research. Yeah, it's very interesting. And so what it suggests is you can override like these influences. But if you take away that capacity to, so I think what I remember about that experiment is those were dieters. So those were people who were trying to watch their weight. And the explanation is that it takes some overhead to do that. So if you distract them with these numbers, then you see the subcortical impulse leap out, right? And so, yeah, I wouldn't deny that. And I'm sort of talking more about things that directly impinge on the hedonic estimation as opposed to that are trying to keep it in check. I think that's a more interesting and complicated scenario. But I would also have different predictions. Like I would say the sensory roots are probably coming through sensory cortex, whereas this control mechanism of thinking about what am I doing now, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing, that's probably coming from more prefrontal mechanisms just based on lesion research. So you might be able to disentangle those using neuroimaging. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Does age have any impact on your results?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so we actually were really fortunate. I had a great graduate student, Greg Samanez-Larkin, who got funding from NIA to look at the impact of age on some of these decision processes. So specifically, we focused on the first task I talked about, just when you anticipate getting or losing money, and then also on the investment task. And we were kind of surprised by the results, but we found a couple of things. One is that when older people, and older I mean, we looked at people from 20 to 85, so from 60 to 85. And we could look either in groups or sort of across the age range. When they anticipated making money, we saw the same kind of activation we saw in younger people. They got equally excited. When they anticipated losing money, we didn't see much going on in their brains. So when they actually lost the money, then we saw signals that indicated that they knew they had lost money and didn't like it. This is actually turns out to be consistent with one of my colleagues' theories about aging. Laura Carstensen. She calls it the positivity effect. And one thing that you find as people age is that if you ask just people how they're feeling on a daily basis, that they tend to report, similarly, if they're healthy, high levels of well-being as to when they were young. But in terms of how worried, anxious, all that stuff, that they tend to report not being as anxious or worried or feeling as negative on a daily basis. And we don't really know why. We don't know if it's they just, get used to things, or they just are unwilling to go there, or they arrange their environment, they're wise, and they say, okay, I'm going to get rid of these things that are bothering me. We don't know. But it's been replicated in several studies. So we actually saw evidence of that in the magnet, actually, which was kind of interesting to us. The other thing that we saw is that when they're doing these risk-taking tasks, these financial risk-taking tasks, we thought they would take less risk than younger adults. That was kind of the stereotype. But they didn't. They took just as many risks. The only difference was that they tended to take more of the risks they shouldn't be taking. So that is to say, they tended to discriminate less between the two risky options. And we actually found that we could account for that based on the activity in their nucleus accumbens. We were scanning them as they did that. So there was a noisier signal in there. And in a subsequent experiment, when we gave them information about the expected value of each of the cues, then they looked like young people in their decision making. Young people got better too. But based on the idea that this area is representing something about expected value, the idea was that if you inject the information in there, then it'll correct the problem, and it seemed to, at least in that experiment. So we're all that to say we're at very early days, and we don't have there's very little data actually on just how healthy aging influences decision making. We're just developing the experimental and neuroimaging tools to look at that now. Oh yeah. Sorry.
I was curious if you have information how much dopamine relates to alpha brainwave states, and if you've done measuring on that correlatively.
We have not. Typically, the alpha states are measured with electroencephalography, which is electrodes that are on this, outside the surface of the skull. The problem with EEG, although it has great temporal resolution, you're sort of outside the skull. So any signals that are coming up are sort of getting baffled by the skull and dispersed. So it's really good for measuring sort of overall frequencies of activity, but not good for getting at the subcortical regions that we like to measure activity from, unfortunately for us, because it would be a lot easier if we could do that. So I don't know if anybody has done a really systematic correlation of when your nucleus accumbens is activated. What are you seeing alpha blocking in the prefrontal cortex, for instance? I don't know of any research that's looked at that. It might just be that the sources are hard to localize. And most of the sources in EEG are coming off the cortex. So there's sort of, the dipoles are lying like this next to the skull, whereas the dipoles in areas we're looking at are all over the place and pointing in different directions.
I just wondered if there was any studies that had given individuals an ability to do biofeedback themselves.
Oh,
with the dopamine.
right.
Okay, so that's
Well, so neurofeedback, has that been done? We're trying to do it actually with the nucleus accumbens, just directly with the fMRI signal. And we've had some success. We haven't published it, because what we found is that if we give people the feedback, we show them actually the activity in that area, they can increase it and decrease it. But the problem is we take away the feedback, they can't do it anymore. And the other problem is they can't do it for more than a couple of seconds, which we should have known. But we were going off of all the assumptions of the cortical people, so which the cortex responds in very different ways. So we're still trying to figure it out. And it's been hard because, NIH doesn't want to fund that because it's pretty high risk research, and people have failed, probably for good, reasons, that they weren't thinking about the physiology, including us.
we can get high, but we can't get high for very long.
So far, that's what we're finding, unfortunately. One last question. Okay, you had a question. Yes.
Yeah, I was trying to see if you combine the risk-taking,
Yeah.
where actually you don't know the outcome or the value of the outcome, with actually showing them the value of the outcome with the pictures and the scent and so on.
Yes.
People do know the value of the outcome.
When they know, like the expected value, for instance. Yeah. So in that one study I mentioned, we have, with the with the investment task. So we actually showed them a graphical representation of the expected value of each of the gambles. And people did become more optimal. So on that task, you can actually quantify how many of their choices match the rational actor. And what I can tell you is that if you're looking at PhD students at Stanford, not a representative sample, their choices match the rational actor 75% of the time, which I thought was pretty darn good. And my colleagues in finance were absolutely horrified, especially when they learned that some of our subjects were their students. I think it's good, though. So now, if we go to the general public, which we have with these kinds of tasks, they get it right about 50% of the time. So there's a big difference. We don't know why. And it's not finance education, because you can look at humanities majors and comparative religion PhDs, and they do well. So we don't really know what accounts for that. If we give people information, like in the community sample, we can get them up to that kind of 70%, 75% level of rational choices. But there is a ceiling. They don't do 100%. And we don't really know why, but I suspect there are probably a lot of reasons, but some of them have to do with sort of emotional biases, that they know they should choose that thing, but they got burned last time, and wouldn't it be easier just to avoid the risk altogether, and that kind of thing. So maybe I'll have better answers for the mechanisms for you in 5 years.
Well, on that note, we'll see you next week for our last class, and we'll actually be talking one more time about how to make good decisions, but we'll look at specific interventions to help people make wise decisions in our last class.
Thanks for the great questions. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.